The briefing room in Washington, D.C. was packed once again. The tension in the air was palpable. Journalists, politicians, and camerasaw focused on one person, Karoline Leavitt. The room buzzed with the faint sounds of pens scratching against paper, chairs shifting, and hushed whispers. But today was different. The stakes were higher. The questions would be tougher. Karoline stepped toward the podium, every move captured by the flashing cameras. She ran her fingers lightly along the edge of the wooden lectern, took a steady breath, and scanned the room. She could already sense what was coming. "Let's get started," she said, her voice firm, clear, and unwavering. The front row reporters exchanged glances. A silent battle was unfolding who would get the first question. A few tense seconds passed before Richard Langley, known for his relentless and confrontational style, raised his hand. Karoline turned her gaze toward him and gave a subtle nod. Richard leaned forward in his chair, his voice cutting through the thick air. "Ms. Leavitt, there's been heavy criticism that the administration's response to the latest terror threat has been inadequate. Do you believe there's a security failure?" The room fell into an uneasy silence. All eyes were on Karoline. The bright overhead lights cast sharp shadows across her face. She quickly gathered her thoughts. She was used to these kinds of questions, but today, Richard's tone was more aggressive, more challenging. She paused for a brief moment, considering not just the question, but why it was being asked now, in this exact way. She knew how easily a single misstep could be twisted into a sensationalized headline. Leaning slightly toward the microphone, she spoke with measured confidence. "Richard, this administration takes every necessary step to ensure the safety of the American people. National security threats are carefully assessed, and actions are taken accordingly. However, revealing operational details could jeopardize our security." Richard tilted his head slightly, then pressed further, his tone sharper this time. "But the public wants the truth. Are you hiding something?" The air grew even heavier. A few journalists in the back sat up straighter, their eyes locked on Karoline. She rested a hand lightly on the lectern, her expression unwavering. "Our responsibility is twofold: to inform the public and to protect them. And let's not forget, some information, if it falls into the wrong hands, can become a direct threat to national security." A faint smirk crossed Richard's face. "So you decide what's important and what's not." Karoline had seen this tactic before. Richard wasn't just asking questions, she was trying to box her in, force her onto the defensive. But she knew the power of silence. Instead of answering immediately, she let the weight of the moment settle, locking eyes with him. Then, in a deliberate tone, she replied, "If you're questioning why certain operational details aren't disclosed, then you're treating national security as a media issue. But let's not forget our adversaries are watching too." A shift rippled through the room. Several reporters exchanged glances, sensing the tables had turned. Suddenly, it wasn't Karoline on the defensive, it was the press itself. Richard twirled his pen between his fingers, as if considering his next move. But for the first time in the exchange, he hesitated. The atmosphere had changed. Karoline had taken control. Before turning to the next question, she tapped the edge of the lectern lightly, a subtle but final gesture. This battle was won. For now. The briefing room was packed to the brim, the air thick with anticipation. Journalists leaned forward, pens poised, cameras rolling, waiting for their moment to strike. At the center of it all, standing firm behind the podium, was Karoline Leavitt. Her golden hair caught the overhead lights, glowing like a halo. She exuded confidence, her shoulders squared, her expression unreadable. With a subtle lift of her hand, she acknowledged a young reporter near the front. Lillian Grace from the New York Post leaned forward, her sharp eyes narrowing behind angular glasses. A smirk tugged at the corners of her lips, signaling she was ready to pounce. "Ms. Leavitt, the budget for public schools has been slashed dramatically. Isn't this essentially signing the death warrant for public education? Or is the plan to abandon students to the mercy of the private sector?" A beat of silence. Karoline took a measured breath, letting the weight of the question settle before she responded. "Our goal is to provide students with better opportunities. A partnership between the public and private sectors is designed to elevate the quality of education, not diminish it." Lillian let out a short, derisive laugh. "So, you're admitting that public schools aren't good enough? Why is the government outsourcing its fundamental responsibility? Why hand education over to corporate interests?" Karoline didn't flinch. Her tone remained steady, her posture unwavering. "The education system must evolve beyond outdated models. Change is never easy, but progress demands it. If we refuse to adapt, we risk failing the very students we seek to help. Lillian's voice grew sharper, her words laced with challenge. Progress? For whom? What about low-income families? Not everyone can afford private schools. What options do they have? Or are you saying, if you don't have money, you don't deserve an education? A flicker of steel flashed in Karoline's eyes. She leaned slightly forward, her voice firm, deliberate. No student is being left behind, Miss Grace. But let's be clear, clinging to a failing system out of fear of change is what truly harms students. The question isn't whether we reform, but whether we have the courage to do what's necessary. Lillian's fingers tightened around her pen. She wasn't done. Necessary? Your so-called reforms are forcing thousands of students out of classrooms. And what about teachers? Have you considered their futures? Or are they just collateral damage? Karoline adjusted the microphone, her gaze locked onto Lillian's with quiet intensity. This administration is committed to bold steps that will improve education for generations to come. We refuse to let fear-mongering stand in the way of real solutions. A heavy silence fell over the room. The only sound was the soft clicking of camera shutters. The weight of her words lingered. She wasn't just answering questions. She was controlling the narrative. The Huffington Gazette. A fierce critic of the administration, Monroe never missed an opportunity to challenge those in power, and today was no exception. He adjusted his tie, leaned forward, and delivered his question with surgical precision. Ms. Leavitt, why is the defense budget increasing? Are taxpayers' hard-earned dollars being funneled into a war economy? A murmur swept through the press corps. Cameras zoomed in, lenses focusing, pens scratched against notepads, capturing every word. Leavitt remained unfazed, tilting her head slightly before responding. The defense budget is a carefully allocated resource designed to safeguard our national security. Monroe wasn't satisfied. His gaze sharpened, his tone edged with skepticism. But this increase is coming at the expense of social programs. Funding is being pulled from healthcare, education, and welfare to fuel military spending. Do you consider that fair? A measured pause. Leavitt's fingers lightly tapped the podium as she gathered her response. Security and prosperity are not opposing forces, Mr. Monroe. They are two sides of the same coin. Without security, there is no economic stability. Without stability, there is no path for growth. Our responsibility is to strike that balance, because failing to do so would leave the American people vulnerable. Monroe wasn't backing down. He leaned in further, his voice pressing. Balance? Or prioritization? Because right now, it seems like the administration has made its choice guns over butter. A flicker of something unreadable crossed Leavitt's expression, but her voice remained steady, unwavering. National security is not a luxury, it is a necessity. The world is evolving, Mr. Monroe, and so are the threats we face. A strong defense ensures that Americans wake up each morning knowing their way of life is protected. Monroe twirled his pen between his fingers, searching for another angle, another way to turn the narrative in his favor. But the energy in the room had shifted. The weight of Leavitt's words lingered in the air, undeniable, immovable. The press briefing continued, but the message was clear. She wasn't just defending policy, she was defining the battlefield. The next question came from journalist Sarah Lindgren, known for her unwavering stance on environmental issues. She wasted no time. Her voice was sharp, unwavering. Ms. Leavitt, your administration's environmental policies are falling short. Don't you think it's time for a more aggressive approach to climate change? Leavitt placed both hands firmly on the podium, leaning in slightly as she locked eyes with Sarah. Sarah, we fully recognize the steps that need to be taken. Our administration is investing in green energy and strengthening regulations to reduce carbon emissions. Sarah didn't wait for her to finish. She cut in, her tone edged with frustration. And yet, fossil fuel companies are still receiving government subsidies. How do you justify that? A ripple of tension passed through the room. All eyes were on Leavitt. She took a slow, deliberate breath before responding. We must strike a balance between economic stability and environmental progress. Sudden, drastic shifts could destabilize industries and put jobs at risk. Our commitment is to sustainable transitions, centering both progress and stability. Sarah's lips tightened into a thin line, skepticism clear in her expression. The battle wasn't over, but Leavitt had already moved on to the next question. In that moment, It was clear. This wasn't just a debate about policy. It was a fight for control of the narrative itself. Veteran journalist Mark Stevenson, known for his relentless questioning on healthcare policies, raised his hand. His voice was steady, deliberate. Ms. Leavitt, there is growing public concern that healthcare services are inadequate and that a significant portion of the population lacks access to affordable care. Why isn't your administration taking concrete action on this issue? Leavitt had anticipated this question. She met his gaze with a composed expression. Our healthcare policies are designed for long-term improvements. Expanding insurance coverage and increasing access to healthcare services remain top priorities. Mark didn't hesitate. He pressed further. But wait times are increasing. Costs are rising. The public isn't convinced by promises, they want results. Leavitt's voice held firm, unwavering. Change takes time. But make no mistake, we are committed to ensuring that every citizen receives the best possible healthcare. A murmur rippled through the room. Pens scribbled furiously. Cameras zoomed in. New questions were already forming. The battle for answers was far from over. The tension in the room was escalating. Questions grew sharper. Reporters talked over one another, each vying to push Leavitt into a corner. This time, the microphone belonged to David Carter, a young journalist known for his fearless questioning on education policies. Ms. Leavitt, schools across the country are struggling with budget cuts, teachers are underpaid, and the education system is steadily declining. What is your administration doing about it? Leavitt leaned slightly against the podium, her expression composed. Education is one of our administration's top priorities. We are actively working to allocate more funding for schools, improve teacher salaries, and implement curriculum reforms. David didn't hold back. Yet, hundreds of schools still lack basic resources. Students are crammed into overcrowded classrooms. What you're saying doesn't reflect what's actually happening on the ground. Leavitt lifted the microphone, her tone unwavering. Reforms take time, David. Transforming the education system doesn't happen overnight. But make no mistake, we are committed to doing what's best for the future of this country's youth. Some reporters nodded. Others scribbled notes furiously. David looked like he had more to say. But Leavitt had already moved on to the next question. From the corner of the room, Rachel Kim quickly raised her hand. Known for her hard-hitting interviews on immigration policies, she wasn't one to hold back. Leavitt gave her a nod. Ms. Leavitt, your administration's immigration policy has been heavily criticized by human rights organizations. What do you have to say about the inhumane conditions reported in detention camps at the border? Karoline Leavitt took a measured breath. Our immigration policy is built on balancing national security and humanitarian values. While enforcing border security, we are also ensuring that humane standards are upheld. Rachel narrowed her eyes. Yet, recent reports revealed children being held in unacceptable conditions, lacking even basic necessities. How does your administration plan to address this crisis? Leavitt's expression hardened, but her voice remained firm. We are actively making necessary improvements. However, every nation must have an immigration policy. The answer is neither open borders nor extreme measures. A responsible and sustainable approach is essential. Rachel looked ready to fire back, but before she could, Leavitt had already turned to another journalist. The atmosphere in the briefing room had grown heavier. The questions kept coming, and Karoline Leavitt handled each one with practiced precision. But everyone in the room could feel it. Today was different. The journalists sensed a shift, as if they had one last chance to push for the hardest questions before the window closed. And then, the floor was given to Jonathan Reid, a senior correspondent at the Washington Post, notorious for his sharp, unrelenting inquiries. Reid leaned back in his chair, then slowly sat forward, his voice cutting through the room with crystal clarity. Ms. Leavitt, your administration has been using the same rhetoric to deflect criticism. People want real answers. Don't you think you're hiding the truth? The room fell into a brief but tense silence. Leavitt met Jonathan's gaze directly. This wasn't just a question, it was a challenge. Adjusting the microphone slightly, she responded with measured confidence. Jonathan, we respect the public's right to information. But there is a fine line between information and manipulation. Criticism is a natural part of journalism. But let's focus on the facts. Our administration is taking the necessary steps to secure this nation's future. Reid arched an eyebrow. But what you're saying doesn't provide a concrete answer. The public doesn't want carefully crafted statements, they want the truth. Leavitt paused, letting the weight of the moment settle before speaking in a tone that carried across the entire room. The truth is often difficult, sometimes complex. But our primary responsibility is to protect this nation's interests. I recognize the power of the media, but let's not forget facts stand the test of time, while manipulation eventually crumbles. For a fleeting moment, the room was silent. Cameras kept rolling. Leavitt took a slow, deliberate breath. This briefing had been a test, and she knew she had passed. But this was only a stepping stone. The game was far from over, and bigger storms were on the horizon. "That's all for today," she said, her voice firm as she turned off the microphone. "Thank you for your questions." Then, she walked out. The storm may have seemed to settle for now, but in reality, it was just beginning.